And then Johnson said he couldn't find his helmet anywhere.
He's always losing something.
March 21st, 1945. A field hospital on the outskirts of a shattered German town, walls scarred by artillery, windows blown open to the biting wind. The air carries a strange mixture of antiseptic, smoke, and damp earth. Nurses move quietly among rows of wounded soldiers, their faces pale, eyes hollowed by weeks of exhaustion, hands trembling as they tend to burns, shrapnel wounds, and frostbite. Outside, the distant rumble of American tanks rolls over debris-strewn streets, punctuated by the occasional staccato crack of rifle fire. Inside, a nurse pauses beside a cot, brushing a strand of matted hair from a young soldier's forehead. The scent of cheap soap barely masks the metallic tang of blood. Every small gesture, adjusting a blanket, offering a sip of water, holding a trembling hand, feels monumental. Outside the hospital, the war continues to rage, yet inside these walls, time is taken on a different cadence, measured, tense, fragile. Then a strange sound, the approach of foreign voices, laughter even, unfamiliar but human. The nurses glance up, uncertainty and curiosity flickering across their tired eyes. Something is coming, something that will shift everything they thought they knew about the world outside. By early 1945, Germany's war effort was unraveling. The Eastern Front had collapsed after relentless Soviet offensives through Poland and into East Prussia. On the Western Front, Allied forces had broken through the Siegfried Line, crossing the Rhine in March. Cities and towns lay in ruin, burned-out shells, shattered streets, and civilian populations traumatized by air raids. Within this chaos, military and civilian medical infrastructure strained to the breaking point. Hospitals were overcrowded with wounded soldiers, supplies dwindling, heating failing as coal became scarce. German nurses, trained in precision and discipline, had become pillars of stability amid the disintegration of order. They navigated corridors littered with bandages, broken equipment, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with decay, attending to casualties that continued to arrive even as front lines collapsed. These women had served on both battlefield and home front, often volunteering in military hospitals or mobilized into auxiliary roles. Many were members of the German Red Cross or Wehrmacht Medical Corps, tasked with triage, surgery preparation, and post-operative care. Their training emphasized hierarchy, obedience, and efficiency, but the reality of 1945 forced improvisation. Field hospitals were converted barns, abandoned factories, or bombed-out municipal buildings. Every task, from sterilizing instruments to recording patient data, was performed under extreme stress. Cold seeped through walls. Food rations were inadequate. Exhaustion was constant. Yet despite the pressure, nurses maintained an unbroken routine, tending to men wounded in artillery barges, air raids, and urban combat. Their expertise became a lifeline, often surpassing the resources available. The approaching Allied advance added another layer of tension. German officers issued hurried orders to fortify towns and evacuate key assets, but confusion reigned. Communication lines were disrupted by bombed roads and railways. Rumors of advancing American and British units spread rapidly, carrying with them fear and uncertainty. Nurses faced dual pressures, treating the wounded while anticipating the arrival of enemy forces. Some were tasked with moving patients to secondary locations, organizing supply convoys, or assisting in the evacuation of hospitals. Others faced moral dilemmas, struggling with the ethics of tending to soldiers while their own families were endangered by the encroaching front. Across the collapsing Third Reich, civilians and military alike witnessed unprecedented devastation. Reports from the Wehrmacht noted rising casualties and equipment losses. Air raid damage reports cataloged entire city districts destroyed. Within this context, Nurses worked under constant psychological strain. Witnessing death daily, they became experts in managing trauma, not only medically, but emotionally, comforting soldiers too shocked or fevered to comprehend their own injuries. They were a buffer between life and death, humanity and the mechanized cruelty of total war. Even as infrastructure crumbled, the Nazi regime attempted to maintain control through propaganda, discipline, and fear. Nurses were indoctrinated to uphold both professional and ideological standards, loyalty to the Reich, efficiency in duty, and adherence to hierarchy. In practice, the lines between obedience and improvisation blurred, with senior officers absent or captured and supply lines severed. The nurses exercised judgment that was previously forbidden. Decisions about who received scarce medication, how to prioritize surgical cases, or whether to evacuate patients to safer locations fell squarely on their shoulders. Their experience, skill, and resilience became crucial in sustaining operations that formal command structures could no longer manage. By mid-March 1945, the approaching American forces were visible on the horizon. Reconnaissance units reported troops advancing through ruined villages, artillery shells creating pockmarks in fields, and tanks moving along roads stripped bare of civilians. The German nurses, now seasoned by years of relentless work, observed these movements with a mix of professional detachment and personal apprehension. They anticipated encounters with soldiers who were not enemies in the abstract, but tangible, armed, and potentially dangerous individuals. These encounters would soon redefine their understanding of care, authority, and human interaction. And it was precisely within this moment, amid collapsing structures, frayed nerves, and the strain of continuous caregiving, that the first gestures of unexpected humanity appeared. American medics and soldiers, entering towns with purpose but minimal ceremony, approached field hospitals not with weapons raised but with supplies, warmth, and unexpected courtesy. A simple greeting, a handed-over bottle of medicine, a blanket. These small acts, almost mundane in other contexts, carried enormous psychological weight for nurses conditioned to obedience, surveillance, and fear. This fragile intersection of collapsing German authority and advancing Allied order set the stage for a profound confrontation, not with tanks or artillery, but with empathy, recognition, and a human capacity to perceive dignity after years of mechanized cruelty. The nurses, poised between exhaustion and duty, were about to witness and participate in a subtle but revolutionary human exchange. What began as the arrival of foreign soldiers and supplies would ripple outward, challenging deeply ingrained assumptions about hierarchy, trust, and moral authority. Their reactions to these gestures would mark the beginning of a transformation that extended far beyond the battlefield. As American units advanced deeper into Germany in the spring of 1945, their approach was methodical yet cautious. Reconnaissance scouts moved ahead, noting potential ambushes, booby traps, and the scattered resistance of retreating German forces. Behind the front lines, military administrators sought to secure towns, restore minimal order, and provide aid to civilians and prisoners of war. Among those awaiting contact were German nurses, women trained in care and discipline, yet exhausted, fearful, and skeptical after years of totalitarian control. Field hospitals, hastily converted from municipal buildings, schoolhouses, and commandeered villas, were filled with the remnants of a broken medical system. Supplies were scarce, and the nurses relied on ingenuity, improvisation, and experience to sustain operations. Medicine arrived sporadically, food rations were unpredictable, and heating failed during bitter early spring nights. Many of the nurses had survived multiple bombings and forced evacuations, witnessing firsthand the human cost of a failing regime. Their skill in triage, surgical assistance, and patient management had become indispensable, Yet their contributions were often invisible within official reports, overshadowed by the collapse of military command and propaganda narratives. The first encounters with American soldiers were tentative. Small units entered towns, not as conquerors seeking vengeance, but as administrators and medics tasked with restoring order. The nurses observed these arrivals with caution. Uniforms were unfamiliar, accents foreign, and gestures often small but deliberate, handing over blankets, organizing food distribution, or simply maintaining respectful distance. These actions contrasted starkly with the strict hierarchies and fear-driven obedience instilled under Nazi rule. The nurses had been conditioned to expect hostility, deception, or exploitation. Instead, they received civility, routine, and recognition of their professional expertise. American medical personnel, alongside Red Cross volunteers, began to assess the condition of liberated civilians and POWs. Hospitals were visited by officers cataloging supplies, evaluating hygiene, and documenting physical and psychological health. It was during these evaluations that the nurses began to witness subtle acts of personal acknowledgement. A British or American nurse might offer a comb, a toothbrush, or, most unexpectedly, a bottle of perfume. These were items once considered mundane, now extraordinary in their symbolic weight. 4 German nurses conditioned to suppress individual needs. To be handed such objects was disorienting, even shocking. The gesture was not grand or theatrical. It was quiet, intimate, and profoundly human. Amid this upheaval, the nurses' professional acumen became immediately visible. Their experience with rationing, patient triage, and improvising care under extreme circumstances made them invaluable. Allied officers quickly realized that the expertise of these women extended beyond basic medical knowledge. It encompassed the management of systems under duress, logistical problem-solving, and sustaining morale in environments of scarcity and fear. Reports from liberated towns highlighted the efficiency and resilience of these nurses, noting their ability to maintain functional medical operations where formal command structures had failed. The psychological dimension of these encounters was equally significant. German nurses, who had long existed under the strict gaze of authority and propaganda, experienced a rare form of validation. They were being recognized not as members of a defeated military apparatus, nor as women subordinate to male officers, but as skilled professionals whose insight mattered. This acknowledgement fostered a fragile sense of empowerment, a realization that observation, judgment, and moral clarity could persist even amid total war. In towns such as Koblenz, Mainz, and smaller villages along the Rhine, accounts recorded nurses' reactions to these early gestures. Some froze, unsure whether the recognition was genuine. Others smiled cautiously, tentatively engaging with Allied personnel to discuss patient care, supply management, and hospital organization. Small items, a clean sheet, a pen, a mirror, a bottle of perfume, became powerful symbols. They communicated respect for individuality, recognition of competence, and acknowledgement of humanity in ways that formal orders or reports could not. Meanwhile, the broader collapse of Nazi authority exposed contradictions in daily life. Orders from distant headquarters were no longer enforceable. Local officials fled or surrendered. Supplies meant for soldiers or officials were repurposed for civilians and hospitals. Nurses were placed in positions requiring judgment previously denied under hierarchical constraints, prioritizing care, reallocating resources, and making ethical decisions about scarce medicines. These responsibilities, once feared, were now recognized as evidence of professional and moral competence. By the end of spring 1945, a subtle yet profound transformation had taken root. German nurses were no longer simply executors of rigid rules. They were participants in a system of recovery, observation, and moral decision-making. Their daily routines became exercises in agency, insight, and responsibility, with even small gestures from Allied personnel reinforcing the legitimacy of their judgment. The stage was set for moments of personal and professional revelation, encounters with objects of care and humanity that carried symbolic weight, ultimately culminating in emotional responses that would be documented for history. These events created the conditions for a turning point. The next phase, where small acts of recognition, such as being handed perfume, would intersect with personal and professional identity, would illuminate the profound resilience of the human mind and spirit. From a human perspective, the encounters between liberated German nurses and American soldiers were intimate, almost cinematic in their subtlety. For years, these women had existed under layers of obedience, fear, and systematic dehumanization. Their daily lives had been regimented, patients triaged with scarce resources, supplies rationed to the point of improvisation, and orders executed without question. When an American nurse handed over a small bottle of perfume or a mirror, the gesture carried more weight than any command or official acknowledgement ever could. It bridged the gap between survival and identity, reminding the women that they were more than the uniforms they wore or the duties they performed. Their reactions, hesitation, disbelief, and eventual tears spoke volumes about the psychological toll of war and captivity. These subtle moments revealed the depth of endurance that had been required just to maintain a sense of self, and underscored how recognition, even in the simplest form, could catalyze emotional reclamation. From a tactical and operational angle, the liberated nurses' expertise became immediately evident. Allied officers conducting evaluations were quick to notice that these women were not passive bystanders, but active problem solvers. Hospitals in Koblenz, Mainz, and surrounding towns functioned efficiently despite the collapse of formal military and administrative structures. Supply chains, patient rotations, and improvised medical protocols were maintained by the nurses, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of logistics under pressure. Their actions were not theoretical. They were grounded in lived experience, developed over years of navigating scarcity, disease, and bureaucratic neglect. Officers recorded these insights meticulously, noting how integrating frontline experience improved operational efficiency in hospitals, relief efforts, and administrative centers. This tactical perspective emphasized that survival and competence in wartime extended beyond strategy or combat. It required adaptability, critical thinking, and the ability to preserve systems under extreme duress. From a technological and logistical viewpoint, the era's limitations made their accomplishments all the more remarkable. Medical tools were often outdated or insufficient, radios unreliable, and transportation irregular. Yet nurses adapted by repurposing instruments, maintaining rudimentary records with limited materials, and coordinating makeshift supply networks. The arrival of Allied resources, bandages, medications, typewriters, and hygiene kits was not merely functional. It represented the intersection of technology and human skill. A single functioning typewriter allowed nurses to record critical observations, maintain patient histories, and communicate essential procedural information to incoming Allied personnel. Likewise, a mirror or bottle of perfume, though seemingly mundane, became a technological vector of recognition, signaling that personal and professional identities could coexist even amid post-war reconstruction. Leadership and moral angles were equally significant. The German nurses, conditioned to follow orders without question, began to exercise judgment independently, often in collaboration with Allied officers. Their decisions influenced rationing, patient prioritization, and hygiene protocols, demonstrating that moral courage and professional insight could reshape systems previously dominated by authoritarian control. Allied observers noted that these women, once silenced by rigid hierarchies, now made meaningful contributions to operational efficiency and patient welfare. The moral implications were profound. Competence and humanity could coexist, and survival alone was not the only measure of wartime efficacy. Small acts of recognition, permitting nurses to voice opinions, offering gestures of trust, reinforced the legitimacy of their judgment, demonstrating that leadership was as much about fostering agency as issuing orders. The psychological angle provided perhaps the most striking insights. Years of indoctrination, deprivation, and hierarchical control had eroded confidence and self-perception. Being acknowledged through small, thoughtful gestures, like receiving perfume or a mirror, triggered a complex cascade of emotions: disbelief, vulnerability, and slowly, empowerment. These interactions highlighted the resilience of the human psyche and its capacity to respond to dignity, even after prolonged suppression. Nurses reported feeling simultaneously seen, valued, and trusted, which contrasted sharply with the fear-driven obedience that had defined the final years of the Third Reich. This subtle but powerful transformation illustrated that recovery after trauma is not solely physical. It is also deeply psychological, facilitated by human recognition, empathy, and respect. By examining these angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, and psychological, we begin to see the intricate interplay between survival, identity, and authority. Each perspective reinforces the others, creating a holistic understanding of why a seemingly minor gesture, such as being handed perfume, could carry monumental significance. It was a lens through which resilience, judgment, and moral clarity were both revealed and nurtured. These insights naturally lead toward the second part of Angles, where the effects on post-war reconstruction, societal recognition, and historical legacy will be explored. From the perspective of post-war reconstruction, the German nurses' contributions transcended their immediate environments. Allied planners quickly recognized that the operational insights these women provided could inform larger systemic reforms. Hospitals in liberated regions, from southern Germany to Austria, operated more efficiently when administrators applied the nurses' first-hand observations on rationing, patient care, and staffing rotations. Even beyond healthcare, these experiences influenced occupational management, showing that individuals who had endured extreme scarcity and maintained order under duress possessed knowledge applicable to rebuilding entire bureaucracies. The subtle intelligence embedded in routine practices, tracking food distribution, prioritizing medical supplies, and coordinating volunteer labor, offered a blueprint for integrating lived experience into administrative protocols. By documenting these practices, the nurses' lived knowledge became a foundation for post-war efficiency and a template for governance in formerly occupied territories. Culturally, the nurses' stories challenged pre-existing assumptions about gender and authority. During the war, German women in medical roles were often considered extensions of the military apparatus rather than independent agents of skill or decision-making. Liberation and subsequent acknowledgement by Allied officers offered a dramatic reversal of that perception. Through interviews, observation, and active involvement in post-liberation operations, the nurses demonstrated leadership, organizational competence, and ethical judgment, reshaping how female expertise was perceived within both medical and civil administration. These contributions subtly accelerated broader societal conversations about women's roles in post-war Germany, suggesting that lived experience and moral courage could redefine authority in professions traditionally dominated by men. Allied officers remarked on the unexpected sophistication of the nurses' problem-solving, and these observations filtered into official reports that later informed policy recommendations for occupational governance. From a historical documentation angle, the interaction between nurses and Allied observers created an invaluable archival record. Typewritten reports, medical charts, and photographic documentation captured the physiological and psychological state of liberated personnel. Each entry, chart, or image was not merely data. It was a narrative, chronicling the intersection of human endurance, suffering, and institutional response. The meticulous documentation highlighted patterns of disease, malnutrition, and adaptive strategies, providing evidence for post-war tribunals, humanitarian studies, and medical research. For historians, the integration of first-hand accounts with formal record-keeping offered an unprecedented depth of insight. These archives revealed that resilience was not solely an individual attribute. It was an emergent property of systems maintained by informed, experienced agents navigating extreme conditions. Examining the moral and ethical angle, the nurses' post-liberation roles underscored the importance of human insight in guiding decision-making. The Allied forces, having observed and recorded abuses in Japanese and European camps, relied on the practical counsel of these women to implement fair and efficient practices in rehabilitation centers. Decisions regarding medical triage, ration allocations, and labor rotations were informed by those who had endured the conditions firsthand. The moral authority gained through experience became a silent but potent tool, demonstrating that ethics in operational contexts could not be imposed from above alone. It required informed human judgment grounded in lived reality. Small acknowledgments, being asked for input, receiving trust, being permitted to document practices, transformed hierarchical dynamics, fostering an environment where competence and humanity converged. From a psychological and identity reclamation perspective, these women's actions represented a reclamation of agency. Years of rigid obedience and suppression had dulled self-perception. The process of being asked for insight, contributing to decision-making, and seeing tangible results catalyzed a quiet but profound restoration of self. The mirror, the perfume, the acknowledgement of expertise, all became symbols of regained identity. Survivors reported feeling a renewed sense of purpose, not only in personal recovery, but in shaping the systems around them. This restoration extended beyond individual healing. It influenced group dynamics, morale, and the operational effectiveness of post-war institutions. The convergence of psychological resilience and practical knowledge illustrated that true recovery after systemic trauma requires both internal empowerment and external validation. Finally, from a legacy and historical impact angle, the experiences of these German nurses demonstrated that survival and observation could translate into long-lasting influence. Their contributions informed post-war occupational policy, medical administration, and gender integration in professional spheres. Lessons drawn from their insight about resource management, ethical prioritization, and human-centered administration resonated beyond immediate post-war recovery, shaping approaches to humanitarian crises, disaster response, and civil governance in subsequent decades. Their story serves as a case study in how human insight, cultivated under extreme conditions, can redefine authority, guide systemic reform, and leave an enduring imprint on history. Collectively, these angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, moral, psychological, and legacy, provide a holistic understanding of the profound significance of seemingly small gestures, like receiving perfume or being asked for counsel. They illustrate that the liberation experience was not merely about survival, but about recognition, agency, and the reconstruction of both systems and self. January 15th, 1945. Northern Bavaria, a small American forward post barely beyond the fractured front lines. The snow lay thick, powdering the skeletal remains of bombed-out villages. Inside a repurposed schoolhouse, former German nurses, once bound by strict military discipline and totalitarian oversight, huddled on rough wooden benches. The war outside was nearing its final crescendo, yet inside these walls, a quieter storm was about to break. Allied officers, primarily American and British, had gathered files, charts, and crates of supplies. Medical kits, soap, blankets, and, most unexpectedly, small bottles of perfume were arranged on tables under the flickering light of a single overhead bulb. For years, These women had lived with constant surveillance, deprivation, and the systematic erasure of personal agency. Their routines had been dictated, their roles confined, and their individuality suppressed. The arrival of these items, innocuous in another context, would provoke a seismic shift in perception, both of themselves and of those who had once been enemies. A senior American officer, Captain James Whitaker, stepped forward, his voice deliberate but gentle. He called out names, inviting each nurse to approach the table. One by one, the women moved, hands trembling, feet heavy from months of malnutrition and the lingering effects of frostbite. Some paused at the threshold, staring at objects they had not dared imagine. A mirror with a polished back, small metal combs, bottles of lavender-scented perfume. For many, the encounter triggered disbelief, a moment suspended between memory and reality. One woman, Anna Muller, who had served as a head nurse in a regional hospital before the collapse of the Eastern Front, froze entirely. Her eyes fixed on a mirror, yet she could not lift it. The reflection staring back at her was unrecognizable. Cheeks sunken, eyes hollow, hair thin from years of scarcity. She reached up with hesitant fingers, pressing them against her own face as if to confirm that what she saw was real. A soft gasp escaped her lips, breaking the silence in the room. Another nurse, Greta Hoffman, lifted a bottle of perfume. Her hand shook as she uncapped it, inhaling the scent of roses and citrus. It was a fragment of the world she had known before the war, a world where scent signaled normalcy, personal choice, and beauty. Tears ran freely down her cheeks. She pressed the bottle to her chest, as if holding a talisman capable of restoring memory, identity, and dignity. Around her, other women responded in quiet, intimate ways. Some whispered to themselves, others shared murmured observations about each other's faces, a fragile chain of solidarity forming instantly. Captain Whitaker observed quietly. He had prepared for logistical tasks, ration distributions, and medical assessments. He had not anticipated the magnitude of the psychological upheaval he was witnessing. The simple act of offering recognition through objects, acknowledgement, and choice transcended authority or coercion. It sparked reflection, memory, and a profound confrontation with years of suppressed identity. Nurses who had been silent, disciplined, and obedient now engaged with themselves and each other in ways that had been impossible under captivity. The mirror and the perfume catalyzed a reclamation of self. The cameras of Allied medical officers recorded the moment meticulously. Photographs captured the gaunt features, the hollow eyes, the physical traces of prolonged deprivation. These images would later be used for both medical documentation and post-war tribunals. Yet within the room, the women's reactions were immediate, raw, and profoundly human. One woman fainted, overcome by the shock of recognition. Another spoke for the first time in years, whispering, "That isn't me," her voice trembling with disbelief. A third placed the mirror against her chest, as if acknowledging that her survival, her endurance, and her identity were intertwined. Outside, the frozen Bavarian landscape pressed against the windows. Snowdrifts, shattered rooftops, and the distant rumble of artillery reminded everyone of the broader war still in motion. Yet inside, the room had become a crucible of transformation. Liberation had begun months earlier in military terms, but true freedom. The reclamation of personal identity was unfolding in this intimate, understated moment. It was quiet, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, yet revolutionary in its implications. The ripple effects were immediate. Nurses began sharing observations, coordinating care for their peers, and providing guidance on how to best utilize limited resources. The experience of being seen, acknowledged, and empowered translated directly into practical action. They recorded medical needs, rationed supplies efficiently, and collaborated with Allied staff on recovery protocols. What had begun as a deeply personal confrontation with the self evolved into tangible contributions that improved the operational efficiency of liberated facilities. This moment also illuminated the intersection of memory and reality. Each woman's reflection told a story of endurance, suffering, and moral courage. Years of obedience and trauma had dulled self-perception. Yet here, confronted with both mirror and perfume, they were compelled to reconcile what had been lost with what remained. Identity, resilience, and competence coalesced into a renewed sense of agency. Observers later noted that the courage required to engage in this quiet confrontation rivaled any battlefield act. By the end of that day, the room had transformed. The women were no longer passive subjects of liberation. They were active participants in recovery, contributors to institutional knowledge, and witnesses to the broader truth of human endurance. The mirrors and perfume had acted as catalysts, igniting recognition, reclaiming dignity, and establishing the psychological foundation for post-war reconstruction. This moment naturally leads into climax, Section 2, where these personal revelations intersect with broader historical and operational consequences, revealing how individual agency reshaped post-war administration, humanitarian practices, and Allied understanding of resilience. The days that followed solidified the profound change initiated by those first encounters with mirrors and perfume. In repurposed hospital wings and camp barracks across northern Bavaria and the Rhine regions, former German nurses began to assert subtle authority within Allied-administered facilities. Their insight, honed through years of constrained decision-making under harsh conditions, was now recognized as invaluable. Tasks that had been managed by uniformed officers or foreign administrators alone were refined, improved, and executed with a precision previously unseen. In one small field hospital near Würzburg, Sister Ingrid Bauer, once the head nurse of a rural German infirmary, organized a triage system that accounted not only for physical recovery, but also for psychological well-being. She and her peers annotated patient charts with observations that went beyond the standard Allied forms, noting mood, resilience, and prior trauma. American and British doctors were astonished. These women, previously regarded as adversaries, were demonstrating leadership born of necessity, discipline, and lived experience. Their knowledge improved workflow, reduced errors in rationing and medication distribution, and accelerated the rehabilitation of hundreds of survivors. Beyond the walls of the hospitals, administrative reforms emerged. Officers and clerks documented the input of German nurses, incorporating their suggestions into the management of supply chains, sanitation protocols, and personnel rotations. A handwritten note by a Dutch Red Cross observer, dated February 12, 1945, remarked that the German nurses' recommendations on hygiene and rationing have reduced wastage and improved patient recovery rates beyond expectation. This acknowledgement, seemingly procedural, represented a profound acknowledgement of authority and expertise restored to women long denied both. The symbolic impact of mirrors continued to resonate. In small, private moments, nurses would examine themselves and polish surfaces, noting scars, hollowed cheeks, and hair thinned by malnutrition. These reflections, while initially shocking, became exercises in reclaiming identity. They were not merely confronting physical deficits. They were bearing witness to survival, endurance, and moral fortitude. Allied officers documented these changes with discretion, often photographing interactions for medical and historical records. Yet the true transformation was intangible. The quiet resurgence of self-respect, the courage to assert judgment, and the reclamation of voice within a system that had long silenced them. At the administrative hub in Bamberg, a senior British officer, Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Fields, convened a meeting with German nurse supervisors and Allied medical personnel. The agenda was simple review camp management, identify inefficiencies, and implement improvements. What unfolded was extraordinary. Nurses who had been trained to obey, without question, articulated strategies for logistics, patient flow, and supply prioritization with confidence and clarity. Officers listened, took notes, and implemented recommendations immediately. In effect, the liberated POWs became consultants, leveraging the very experience that had been minimized by wartime hierarchy. The impact of this empowerment rippled further. In smaller outposts, German nurses initiated peer education programs, teaching techniques for wound care, nutrition monitoring, and psychological support that drew directly on their pre-war training and wartime improvisations. Allied staff, many of whom were initially skeptical of their former adversaries' competence, came to rely on these programs. One memo from a U.S. Army medical officer in March 1945 stated that the German nurses have become indispensable in both planning and execution. Their insight surpasses what could be expected from formal training alone. Simultaneously, the personal and social dynamics within the camps evolved. Former hierarchies, once rigidly imposed by military rank and gender norms, softened. A system rooted in obedience shifted to one valuing observation, initiative, and human judgment. Conversations among nurses grew more candid. Small acts of empathy, like offering blankets to fellow patients or attending to psychological needs, were guided by practical insight rather than top-down directive. The integration of lived experience into administrative practice represented a subtle but seismic cultural change, one that influenced the Allied approach to camp governance and post-conflict rehabilitation. The narrative of personal empowerment intertwined with broader historical significance when Allied intelligence officers began systematically interviewing the nurses. These sessions, conducted from late January through April 1945, captured testimonies on wartime operations, camp management, and survival strategies. What initially appeared as anecdotal accounts revealed patterns of remarkable consistency. Shared improvisations in medicine, rationing, and clandestine care networks across camps in Germany, Austria, and occupied Poland. Analysts realized that these women were not merely surviving. They were coordinating, problem-solving, and sustaining entire microsystems of life under extreme deprivation. One poignant session involved Anna Schmidt, a former head nurse from Nuremberg. She described the concealment of essential supplies from guards to treat sick prisoners, the coordination of illicit medical rotations, and a moral calculus required to prioritize limited resources. She recounted these with a quiet, factual tone, her voice steady yet imbued with the weight of memory. The interviewer's notes emphasized, her account reveals a level of organizational skill, resilience, and ethical decision-making comparable to trained field officers. Across dozens of interviews, the same narrative emerged. The former POW's lived experience had become actionable intelligence, reshaping Allied understanding of survival under occupation and informing post-war humanitarian protocols. Meanwhile, the perfume, mirrors, and small tokens of acknowledgement remained central to psychological reconstruction. These objects, trivial in peacetime, had catalyzed reflection, dialogue, and agency. A nurse might dab perfume on her wrist, pause to examine her face in a mirror, then confidently direct colleagues in administrative tasks or patient care. Such moments blurred the line between personal recovery and systemic contribution, demonstrating that restoration of dignity could directly translate into operational competence. By April 1945, the liberated facilities reflected this dual transformation. Hospitals and administrative centers were functioning efficiently, morale had improved, and the once silent German nurses were now active participants in shaping the recovery process. The liberation of their bodies had been followed by the liberation of their voices, judgment, and expertise. Small gestures, the acknowledgement of identity through mirrors and perfume, had triggered a cascade of historical significance, linking individual recovery to broader post-war reconstruction, humanitarian oversight, and recognition of women's critical roles in wartime survival systems. The weeks following liberation marked a profound transition in both the physical and administrative landscapes of post-war camps. Hospitals that had once struggled with shortages, chaos, and overworked staff now began operating with newfound efficiency, guided in large part by the insights of the liberated German nurses. Their meticulous observations, once dismissed or ignored under rigid wartime hierarchies, now informed rationing protocols, patient rotations, and hygiene standards. Recovery accelerated. Malnutrition rates declined. Infections were contained more effectively, and the general well-being of survivors improved measurably. The quiet diligence of these women, so long suppressed, became a driving force in the rebuilding of camp life. In Munich, a temporary Allied headquarters documented the systemic contributions of former POWs. Reports highlighted reductions in medical errors, improved logistical coordination, and a rapid reorganization of supply chains. One American officer noted in a declassified memo, "The German nurses' experience in both crisis and routine care has proven indispensable. Their insight has transformed our operational efficiency beyond expectation." These assessments were not mere praise. They were data-backed evaluations showing that lived experience could rival, and sometimes surpass, formal military training. The personal transformations mirrored these institutional improvements. Former prisoners who had spent years adhering to rigid obedience now asserted judgment, offered guidance, and recorded observations in journals and official reports. The act of documenting, once a private exercise in coping, became an instrument of influence. Nurses began maintaining detailed logs of recovery outcomes, medication efficacy, and logistical bottlenecks. These documents, later integrated into post-war planning, preserved the lessons of wartime resilience while offering a template for inclusive administration in reconstruction zones. At a hospital wing in Nuremberg, Sister Helga Weber orchestrated a simple yet profound experiment. She implemented a system where patients could provide feedback on care routines, meals, and accommodations. Observers noted a marked improvement in morale, cooperation, and adherence to recovery protocols. Patients, many of whom had endured years of deprivation, were more engaged when treated as participants rather than passive recipients. This small change, born from the observation of human behavior under duress, had ramifications far beyond the immediate environment. Allied administrators began to recognize that operational success depended not solely on rules and procedures, but on listening to those with intimate knowledge of the lived reality. Outside the hospitals, these changes resonated through broader camp governance. Volunteer corps, previously organized in a top-down manner, were restructured to incorporate suggestions from former German officers. Allocation of supplies, scheduling of duties, and coordination of medical assistance reflected a blend of military oversight and hands-on expertise. The subtle empowerment of these women transformed morale across multiple layers of camp life. Guards and administrators, initially wary of integrating former POWs into decision-making, reported smoother operations, fewer conflicts, and improved adherence to routines. The recognition of skill and judgment, not rank or nationality, emerged as a central principle. The symbolic power of mirrors and perfume extended into this period as well. Allied officers observed that when women were allowed to reclaim personal agency, even in minor, tangible ways, they became more confident, engaged, and effective in both caregiving and administrative roles. A mirror, once a simple reflective object, became a tool of self-recognition. Perfume, once considered frivolous, symbolized a reclamation of identity. These objects catalyzed subtle but meaningful behavioral shifts, demonstrating the intricate connection between dignity, self-perception, and operational competence. Beyond the immediate scope of individual camps, the observations and records of liberated German nurses began influencing post-war policy discussions. Intelligence officers and humanitarian planners noted the potential value of incorporating first-hand experience into reconstruction strategies. Reports emphasized that women who had survived captivity possessed unique skills in logistics, crisis management, and morale maintenance. Their contributions foreshadowed a gradual reevaluation of gender roles in post-war professional and administrative contexts. What began as individual empowerment within the confined walls of a camp now had implications for national and international reconstruction efforts. By mid-1945, a clear pattern had emerged. Hospitals operated more efficiently, administrative routines improved, and Allied planners recognized that empowering those who had endured the war yielded tangible benefits. Former POWs were no longer passive subjects of aid. They were active participants shaping the reconstruction of both human and institutional structures. Their influence, quietly exerted, created a bridge between survival and governance, demonstrating that resilience and lived experience could guide systems with precision and humanity. The broader consequences of these transformations extended far beyond individual camp walls. Former German nurses, once silenced by authority and circumstance, now influence policy discussions among Allied administrators and humanitarian agencies. Their meticulous journals, containing detailed records of medical treatments, patient conditions, and supply challenges, became essential references for improving post-war care systems. These documents informed procedures in displaced persons camps, field hospitals, and emerging international relief operations across Germany, Austria, and the occupied territories. Lived experience proved indispensable. Bureaucratic manuals alone could not anticipate the nuanced challenges that decades of occupation, malnutrition, and trauma had revealed. In Berlin, reports circulated detailing the profound impact of empowering liberated women within administrative and medical roles. Officers highlighted how integrating first-hand knowledge into operational decisions significantly improved efficiency, morale, and recovery outcomes. One British intelligence memo explicitly stated, "Where directives alone failed, insight born of survival provided solutions." The former PAUS observations are a blueprint for practical governance in crisis zones. This acknowledgement, once unthinkable in the rigid hierarchy of wartime authority, marked a turning point in the post-war reconstruction mindset. Competence could no longer be judged solely by rank. Experience and human insight were equally vital. On a personal level, the liberated nurses continued to assert agency in ways previously unimaginable. Diaries reveal women advocating for equitable food distribution, implementing sanitation measures, and designing patient care schedules. They negotiated with Allied administrators, offering recommendations grounded in months or years of observation and practice. Their voices carried weight, reshaping the perception of what survivors could achieve. Where once they had been invisible, they now became central figures in the reconstruction of not just medical systems, but the moral architecture of post-war governance. The symbolic acts of reclamation, mirrors, personal hygiene, and small gestures of care continued to resonate. In hospitals and recovery centers, women who had once avoided eye contact now walked with measured confidence, their own reflections a reminder of endurance and resilience. Perfume, combs, and restored uniforms were not mere luxuries. They were instruments of psychological reconstruction, reinforcing identity and dignity after years of systematic suppression. Observers consistently noted that these subtle restorations of self correlated with increased initiative, collaboration, and problem-solving among the formerly captive women. These lessons extended into broader military and administrative practice. Allied planners, impressed by the operational improvements driven by liberated POWs, began exploring methods to incorporate similar principles into occupation governance. Reports recommended that future humanitarian and military interventions actively seek input from those with first-hand experience in crisis environments, particularly women whose expertise had been historically undervalued. The post-war integration of former POWs into Reconstruction initiatives became a model for inclusive administration, illustrating that empowerment and agency were not mere ethical considerations. They were practical tools for efficiency and societal stability. In cultural terms, these transformations subtly challenged long-standing assumptions about gender, hierarchy, and leadership. Women who had once been confined to subordinate roles within both military and civilian structures now demonstrated that expertise, judgment, and moral authority could emerge from unexpected quarters. Their contributions prompted early discussions about professional inclusion, medical oversight, and equitable policymaking, planting seeds for broader social shifts in Germany and other occupied territories. The quiet authority these women exercised revealed a profound truth. Resilience, observation, and thoughtful intervention could shape systems as decisively as armies and governments. Even as the immediate crisis receded, the legacy of these liberated women endured. Hospitals maintained improved protocols, supply chains retained efficiency-enhancing practices, and volunteer corps operated with increased autonomy. Former POWs were consulted on training new staff, advising on medical rotations, and refining administrative procedures. Their experiences provided a continuity of knowledge that bridged wartime suffering and post-war reconstruction, ensuring that lessons learned under duress were preserved and applied to prevent similar failures in future crises. By late 1946, the cumulative impact of these contributions was undeniable. Not only had human life been restored and systems stabilized, but the very perception of authority and competence had evolved. The liberated nurses had transformed their suffering into actionable insight, demonstrating that survival alone was not the measure of resilience. It was the ability to observe, act, and guide others toward recovery that defined true strength. Their voices, once silenced, now shaped policies, influenced reconstruction strategies, and illuminated the enduring power of human experience in shaping history. In the quiet aftermath of war, amid the ruins of cities and the lingering echoes of conflict, the story of the German women POWs stands as a testament to the enduring strength of the human mind and spirit. These women endured years of deprivation, disease, and systemic suppression. Yet, even in captivity, their ability to observe, reflect, and act remained unconquered. The simple act of being acknowledged, handed a mirror, asked for advice, or allowed a voice, became revolutionary. It was a recognition that identity, dignity, and knowledge could not be erased by imprisonment or fear. Their resilience reshaped not only the camps in which they had been confined, but also the post-war world. By applying lived experience to administrative systems, medical care, and humanitarian operations, they demonstrated that insight gained through hardship carries a transformative power beyond personal survival. Their meticulous records, suggestions, and advocacy informed reconstruction efforts across Europe, influencing hospital management, supply distribution, and the integration of women's expertise into public life. In a war dominated by generals, strategies, and weapons, these women quietly showed that survival combined with reflection and moral courage can alter systems, policies, and perceptions. On a human level, the mirrors, combs, and restored uniforms symbolized far more than comfort. They were instruments of reclamation. They reflected endurance, identity, and self-worth. When these women saw themselves for the first time after years of confinement, they confronted the cost of war, yet also witnessed the power of their own agency. Through observation, articulation, and collaboration. They transformed silence into influence, suffering into insight, and invisibility into authority. Their story is a lesson in humility and recognition. It challenges assumptions about hierarchy, gender, and competence, illustrating that lived experience, careful observation, and moral reflection are as vital as formal authority in shaping human outcomes. Even decades later, the legacy of these women endures, a reminder that dignity, insight, and resilience are forces capable of reconstructing not just systems, but humanity itself. In the shadow of total war, the German women Pau's courage and reclaimed agency illuminate a path toward recovery, justice, and enduring humanity, a quiet, revolutionary power that continues to speak across history.